Okay, so sometimes ecosystems change, and when they change over time, we call that succession. This occurs naturally, but also following a disturbance. So examples of disturbance might be fire, a hurricane, or logging, and changes might be the changes in the species present, but it could also be changes that we see like in the soil chemistry. Some species are characterized as early successional or late successional. So after one of these disturbances occurs, the first species to show up are the early successional ones, and then as time goes by and the community develops more, then later on we get these late successional species. Some species really like disturbance. They're disturbance adapted species, and these are generally these early successional species. So every time a fire goes through, you might get certain species show up that really like that fire and are these early successional species. We do see that human activities can interfere with natural successional processes. So grazing, so like the presence of cattle, might always eat the late successional species and make it so the late successional species never get established. We also see that systems don't always return to their previous state after a disturbance, and we call these alternative stable states. So you might change the ecosystem. It might never go back to the ecosystem it was before, but it might develop another stable ecosystem that will persist a long time. So this is an example of primary succession where we start with bare rock where there's nothing living. They call it here the pioneer community, where they have lichens and mosses that colonize the rocks. And once the lichens and mosses break down the rocks a little bit and soil starts to accumulate in some of the areas, we start to get small plants. And then over time, as the rocks get broken down and even more and more sediment accumulates, you start to get enough soil to support some small trees. And then over time, you might end up with a climax community, which are the trees that will live there the longest. So as I said, that's an example of primary succession. This is when you start with no living organisms and then slowly develop different communities over time. So like rocks, a good example of primary succession. If a volcano occurs and there's a lava flow and it creates new land, then that's also called primary succession. Secondary succession is when an existing community is disrupted and a new one develops from what survived the disturbance. So an example of this might be clear cutting. You might cut down all the trees, there's no forest there, but slowly over time, a community is going to develop if you don't do anything to it. So at first, there might just be small plants, and then over time, you might get some trees that come in quickly, and then over time, you might get trees that come in later to get a climax community. So climax community is the one that develops last and remains the longest. A lot of times we talk about forests, but forests don't have to be the only kind of climax community. Different ecosystems have different amounts of complexity, which is basically the number of trophic levels and the number of species in each trophic level. Diverse communities may not be very complex if they're all clustered in a few trophic levels. We can also have highly interconnected communities that might have many trophic levels. Complex interconnected communities are thought to be more stable and resilient in the face of disturbance because there's so much redundancy. There's many different species performing some similar roles, which means that if we lose a couple of species, we're more likely to have a stable ecosystem through time. Another thing that adds to complexity is the different types of interactions between different species. One important one is called symbiosis, which is when two or more species live intimately together with their fates linked. Now, there are three different types of symbiosis. though a lot of people get symbiosis and mutualism confused, and I even see that like in nature documentaries. Sometimes they'll talk about symbiosis, but they actually mean specifically mutualism. Mutualism is when both species benefit from the association. It can be obligate, meaning that they have to have that, or it could be facultative, meaning that they might do better if that other species is around, but they'll still survive if it's not around. So examples of mutualism include things like pollination. So butterflies are getting nectar from flowers. Flowers are benefiting from their pollen being moved around so that they can reproduce. Commensalism is when one species benefits and the other one is not benefited or harmed. A good example of commensalism is like a bird nesting in a tree. The bird is benefiting a lot because they're up off the ground, away from predators. They get to have their nest in the tree, but the tree really doesn't care. The nest isn't hurting the tree. It's not helping the tree. So that's an example of commensalism. Parasitism is one you probably know already. This is where one species benefits and the other one is harmed. It's similar to predation, but usually parasites don't kill their host. So the parasite is dependent on the host, which means that it's living intimately together with that other species, whereas a predator is just eating them and then moving on. So a little different. So some more examples. Here's an example of a mutualism. A coral is actually a mutualism. There is the coral animal that builds the structure of the coral reef. And there are algae that live inside the coral. And the coral provides the algae with nutrients and access to sunlight, whereas the algae provides the coral with sugars, carbohydrates produced by photosynthesis. Sometimes this mutualism gets disrupted. We're seeing this a lot with climate change, where hot temperatures stress out the coral, and the coral actually basically spits out the algae because it's stressed out, and that causes it to bleach. It's not dead yet here where it's white. And if this is all that bleaches on the coral, it might recover. So like more algae from over here might reestablish, and it might be okay. If the whole thing bleaches and it bleaches for a long time, it's probably going to die. So this shows a succession where there's a healthy coral reef. This is a bleached coral reef, and this is it all dead with a different kind of algae colonizing and taking over. Here's some examples of commensalism, so where one partner benefits and the other is not harmed or hurt. So there's a lot of these out there. So like lichens living on a tree is another example, or epiphytes like bromeliads, which you see here. They're not hurting the tree. They're not helping the tree. They're just living there. But the moss or lichens or bromeliads are really benefiting from being able to be up on this tree instead of on the ground. Another example is a sloth. It's got algae on its fur. The algae are benefiting a lot. The sloth could really care less. All right, next up are parasites, the final type of symbiosis. They can be internal or external. So external are things like lice or ticks or mosquitoes biting you. It could be internal, like certain kinds of worms that might infect a gastrointestinal tract. We also have some different examples of parasites. Parasites usually don't kill their hosts. They take something, but then they want their host to be healthy because they want to be able to keep taking energy and nutrients from them. Parasitoids are special cases where they actually kill their host. So parasitoids are generally wasps, and they will lay their eggs inside usually another insect, where the larvae will develop inside this other insect and then basically eat it from the inside out. and eventually will kill that. So a lot of times it's wasps laying eggs inside caterpillars that are parasitoids. Another example is a brood parasite. Man, I don't know why I can't say that today. This is when one species of bird lays their eggs in another species' nest. This is a songbird, and this is a brown-headed cowbird chick. So brown-headed cowbirds are nest parasites. They usually follow herds of American bison, and so they're always on the move. So they don't ever stop to raise their own young in their own nests. So they trick other species of birds into raising their young, and you can see this chick is way bigger than the adult, and this adult is working really hard to feed this brown-headed cowbird chick. And its own young probably won't survive because it's spending so much time feeding this other bird. We also get introduced species sometimes, and I'll go into that in the next section.